Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Strategies for Reengaging Students Sidelined by the COVID-19 Pandemic. We are really looking forward to this discussion. Today's webinar will be recorded and we'll be sending you a copy of today's recording after the webinar. And during the webinar, the audience will be muted and we encourage you to share any questions or comments that you have as we'll be available to engage with you all. And we'll also be sharing links to specific resources in the chat box. And we encourage you to share ideas and strategies that are working well at your institution. My name is Serena Fahnbulleh Crain, and I am the Senior Manager of Partner Success at Persistence Plus. And at Persistence Plus, we leverage behavioral science to design nudges delivered as text messages to students' phones. And these nudges support student success by promoting equity, keeping students motivated, helping them overcome challenges as they experience them, and keeping them connected back to key resources to help them along the way. And while we supported tens of thousands of students on our platform through this challenging year, some of our partners came to us with questions regarding how they could re-engage students who left their institution because of COVID-19 challenges and help them re-enroll for the fall semester. And so we realized that many institutions are struggling with these same questions. And so we brought together a panel of experts who are well-versed in understanding the challenges that students are facing right now and how best to support their enrollment journey. We're delighted to have with us today Hadass Sheffer, who's the co-founder and former president of the Graduate Network, Sarah Ansell, who's the founder and CEO of Student Ready Strategies, and Dr. Ross O'Hara, Director of Behavioral Science and Education at Persistence Plus. Before we begin, we'd like to start with two polls to learn more about those of you who are joining us this afternoon. And so you'll see that there's two questions. If you scroll down, you'll see the second question. One that asks the type of institution that you work for, and that's a single choice question. And another poll that asks what type of student you're focused on re-engaging this summer, which gives you multiple options. So feel free to not just limit your choice to one. If you do select other on either poll, please share a comment with us in the chat to let us know where you're from, or if you have any additional thoughts around student groups to re-engage. And so I see that answers are coming in, so we'll give another 10 seconds or so for people to wrap up before we move on. Great, so let's wrap up our poll right now. And let's take a look at the results. You should be seeing them on your screen right now. It looks like for those who answered, we have a lot of people joining us from community colleges this afternoon, as well as four-year institutions, a few from nonprofits, so that's really great. And then regarding the students that you're focused on re-engaging this summer, it seems like the bulk of you are looking for students who dropped out of college during the pandemic. And then we also see never showed up during the pandemic, became underemployed or unemployed during the pandemic, and adult learners with time away from college. So I thank you all for sharing, and again, welcome you if you have any other comments or questions as we're moving on to please share them in our chat box. All right, so let's move into some introductions. Hadass, we'll begin with you and then we'll move on to Sarah and then we'll end with Ross before we start our questions.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Hadass Sheffer. Almost 17 years ago, I started looking at why some people dropped out of college and didn't finish. And from that inquiry, I went on to develop the Graduate Philadelphia, which was a program in Philadelphia to address the 80-some thousand people who had never finished their college degree. And over the years, it grew into the Graduate Network. When I handed over the baton of the Graduate Network in late 2020, We have been serving over 80,000 students across the country in 41 communities, including 7 states. My concern is that during the pandemic, a lot of adults lost ground. They stopped out again, and they may not see their way to make a comeback now after things are beginning to open up, because a lot of people still remain unemployed and are not quite sure what the future holds for higher education.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Ansel, founder and CEO of Student Ready Strategies. Student Ready Strategies is a equity-focused technical assistance and consulting organization, really rooted in the belief that every student can succeed. So what we do is we work with colleges and universities across the country to help them evolve to ensure those students do. If you're curious about our name, we derive that from this idea of we want people to stop asking if students are college ready, start asking if colleges are student ready. And so we help our colleges and universities become student ready, particularly for those populations historically marginalized in higher education.
Great. And Ross?
Yes, welcome everyone. My name is Ross O'Hara, the Director of Behavioral Science and Education at Persistence Plus. I'm a social psychologist by training, and one of my main roles here at Persistence Plus is translating behavioral science interventions that have been shown to increase equity for students who have been historically excluded in higher education, and translating those interventions into automated text-based conversational messages, what Serena referred to as nudges, so that these types of interventions can reach tens of thousands of students at a time. My other main role here is working with our college and nonprofit partners to teach them about behavioral science so they can imbue these psychological principles when they're thinking about how to redesign student supports or how to communicate effectively with their students. And so as part of this work for the past couple of months, I've been doing a lot of looking at our data on what students have been saying about their lives and their educational experiences ever since this pandemic began, as well as talking directly to students, mostly in that 18 to 22-year-old range, about their experiences either being in college during this time or the reasons why they left college during this time, or some of those high schoolers who just never even started college because they didn't want to start during a pandemic. So I'm excited to be here and share with you some of what we've learned.
Great. Thank you so much all for the introduction. And now we can move into our conversation. And so we'd like to start with talking about a population that's near and dear to all of you, adult learners. You each have unique expertise when it comes to enrolling, retaining, and graduating adult learners. And I'd like to hear from each of you what your thoughts are on how colleges can better serve adult learners as we climb out from the pandemic. Hadass, let's start with you. Could you share your insights about why adult learners have left college in the past and some strategies about what colleges might do at this time to convince them to return this fall?
Thank you. So over the years, we've through the research that the Graduate Network did with our comebackers, as we called them, we found that the primary cause that everyone cited, just about everyone cited, was the cost of college, and that cannot be ignored. But people also said that time was an issue, finding time, prioritizing themselves ahead of their children, because often adult students are also parents and they have a lot of other responsibilities. And feeling not very connected to other students in the classroom, younger students. That last reason we found evaporated pretty quickly once people were in the classroom and realized that everyone can contribute at the college level in the classroom. But the feeling of not belonging in college, we found was pretty strong as well. And so people stop out primarily because college, the way it is, does not quite fit in with their lives. You know, the hours where support services are open might not be the hours where students are on campus, or it's hard to find the place, or more people now are learning online. How do you find the supports? I think there's also a huge market now that is targeting people, and it's not necessarily through the traditional colleges and universities. We found that a lot when we started Graduate way back in the day. It was the Apollo group that was the big behemoth. I don't know if anyone remembers it, but they had online, they promised online courses leading to degrees. Many people went into debt and the degrees did not materialize. So there's a lot of energy now around online learning, and it's not necessarily coming from colleges and universities. And I'm sure you're all feeling the heat of this. How do you stand out? I think for adult learners, for working learners, authenticity is key. We also found out that they need a lot of prompts and a lot of patience.
Great. Thank you, Hadass, for giving us that context and sharing some of those strategies. Sarah, once adult learners are recruited back into higher education, what should colleges be doing to help them feel accepted and supported, and to make sure if they do come back that they're able to finish?
Sure. I love answering this question, so thank you for that. When we talk with colleges who are looking specifically to serve the adult student population, we encourage kind of a three-pronged framework around thinking about the adult learner. So we want colleges to think about orientation, navigation, and acceleration for adult learners. So when we talk about orientation, the most important thing that a college can do to send a signal to an adult student that they are welcomed, that they are embraced by the institution, is to embrace the college level credit worthy knowledge that the student comes in with. So there are a number of ways to do that, being generous with how transfer credits are evaluated and applied, avoiding this idea of expired credits, where if you learned it more than 10 years ago, it doesn't count anymore. And then being really systematic about student access and support for credit for prior learning, like CLEP or portfolio evaluations. So doing that early on in that student journey really signals value, and it also shortens that path to degree. When we think about navigation, and I think Hadass already hit on this already, but once they're enrolled, there are a lot of things that those students have to do that doesn't have to do with the classroom. So they have to navigate financial aid and bursar and the registrar, and having, streamlined administrative processes where adults can figure it out easily on their own, having those extended business hours so that those offices are open when the students are on campus, but also supporting them with a dedicated coach who they can just go to with whatever is happening and whatever they need to resolve, and that coach can walk them through things. And then finally, when it relates to acceleration, we see that a lot of adults don't have a whole lot of time to spare, as Hadass said, but so they don't necessarily have a lot of free time in their schedule, but they also don't have 8 years to spend in college before they can get that degree and start using it in the workforce. So looking at accelerated term structures, I love these where, it might be an 8-week or a 4-week class schedule. Students can take fewer classes at a time, so they're not juggling as much, but they're still progressing to graduation at a really good pace. And then also, if something goes wrong in that structure, if you're in a 4-week, one course at a time, and something goes wrong, you might lose 2 weeks, but then you're back in the classroom faster, and you haven't lost, a whole semester worth of, all the different credits that were accumulated. So we love those accelerated term structures. And then the other place we see adults in particular, and students of color in particular, getting slowed down in higher education is if they're placed into traditional developmental sequences before they can access their college level math and English courses. So we are big champions of multiple measures assessment for placement. So, if there isn't an SAT or ACT score, or it's not great, but the high school GPA was great, looking at different ways for students to access those college level courses. And if it does seem like they might need a little support to pass those courses, doing that as a co-requisite in the same semester rather than a long series of developmental courses. So that can be a really good strategy, really great for all students, but particularly adults if they've been away from math for a while. That can be a big stressor. So being able to signal you are ready for college level math and you have the support to get it done.
Thank you, Sarah. And I see Cecilia is shared in the chat asking if anyone has begun or expanded accelerated term structures in the pandemic and how that's working. So please, audience, if you have, we'd love to hear it. Ross, Persistence Plus has been nudging adult learners since 2012, but colleges found our platform even more pivotal during the pandemic, supporting this population through their various challenges. What have you learned from adult students about what they might need when they return to college?
Sure. So one of the things that struck me most when the pandemic started last March was how much adult learners were responding to messages. And I think the outreach was really important. I think adult learners especially have an expectation to really be kept in the loop and be treated as sort of equal partners in their education with the institution. And so we definitely got a lot more feedback, both the negative of adult learners, being angry, frustrated, upset about the experience. There was definitely this palpable sense of this isn't fair. Nobody asked me what I wanted. So things just happened. And we know that institutions out there reacted to the pandemic in a matter of days trying to save the semester. So there wasn't time to have focus groups or do interviews or something. But that violation of procedural justice was palpable, but also a lot of the positives of, wanting to be able to share their stories of like how they were getting through all of this, both personally and educationally. And many students were, especially the adult learners, were so proud to say like, hey, I've never taken an online course. I've never done anything like this. I came out with a B-, like, that's awesome. And so I think just a lot of proactive outreach, it relates to what Hadass said about really being patient with adult learners, that you need a lot of contact to get them re-engaged. The second thing is really just listening. So again, that sense of these adult learners saying like, this wasn't fair. Nobody asked us like how we wanted our education to go during a pandemic. So I think when you're thinking about your outreach, no matter how you're doing it, really making space to like listen to these adult learners about what their life situation is and what they think they need to succeed, and not making it all one way. And then I think the biggest thing I've been hearing or learning about what adult learners say they need to succeed is just flexibility. I know both Sarah and Hadass touched on adult learners, having a lack of time in their lives for education. But I know, some of the research points more toward that's not so much they lack the time, it's just the time they have doesn't align with, the time that colleges provide. If all the classes are between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. and that's working time, like that's not going to work for a lot of adult learners. So it's kind of this weird jigsaw puzzle, and it's always changing for adult learners, especially. They may be seeking new employment opportunities, and we all know many of those employment opportunities, they don't give you the same hours every single week, and that's always shifting. And I know adult learners, had so many challenges this year with their kids being home full time and having to care for their children. And now we see a lot of situations where maybe their children are in school, but they're in school 2 days a week, and then the next week it's 3 days a week. Excuse me. And who knows if this fall, schools are going to have targeted quarantine, shutdowns because they have some COVID cases. And so excuse me, having that flexibility, signaling this ongoing flexibility that if you commit to this in August and your life is different in September, you don't have to quit. Like, we will work with you to make sure you can keep going.
May I piggyback on what Ross just said about the stopping? So in my research, my team and I found that most adults stop at some point, adult learners, and I'm classifying now all learners. You know, the population that we're looking at are the new learner. Let's call them the new learner. The new learner has multiple responsibilities. They're not going to college full-time in a residential setting. So the new learner wants to integrate learning on their timeline. And it means that classes can't necessarily be from 9 till 4, as Ross said, but it also means that it's natural for people to take some classes, some courses, and then to stop out. And we can't panic about it. What we do need to do is stay in touch with them and say, we totally get it. It's hard to commit to every semester or 12-week starts or 8-week starts. It's hard to continue this throughout the year. Your summers are not necessarily going to look the same. We're here for you when you're ready to learn, and we'll support you. And I think this approach has worked for colleges that have shifted to multiple starts per year. And if you're not sure what that looks like, you can look at, I think, Empire State, Thomas Edison State University. I'm sure a lot of other places have multiple starts during the year so that students can take some time off between. But what we did find out is that you can't just assume that they'll come back when they're ready, because other things might have cropped up. So staying in touch with them is super important. And that's why platforms like Persistence Plus, I think, come into play. If we had Persistence Plus when I started graduate, it would have been so good, because what we found was that we had about 14 touches per person. And our touches were, this was before text, right? Or through phone calls. And you had to keep track of where the person's phone number was and when to reach them. We needed 14 touches to get someone back each time. And these touches needed to be tailored to that person. Again, if we had a platform like Persistence Plus back then, that would have been better. We did this, manually, calling people, trying to figure out what made them tick and what made them come back. So patience, persistence on your part, I think will pay off.
Thank you, Hadas. I think the point that you just made and all the points that you made are so pertinent at this time. I think that one thing that I've learned from just hearing and seeing what the students have been experiencing on our platform is how important it is to have that connection and maintain that connection, not just during an international pandemic, but during their education, during more normal times as well. And I think what I'm hearing from all three of you as well is the importance of flexibility. I love what you said, Hadas, about the new learner, and recognizing that education isn't one size fits all for any student, but particularly for adult learners. So thank you for that. I just wanted to pause for a moment and check in with the audience. Just say, feel free to share questions or comments. If you don't have questions, if you like something that someone said and you want to hear more, please let us know. And I also wanted to, check in with you all to see what strategies that you've been employing to re-engage students this summer. Are there any campaigns that your institutions are doing, any new programs that you're doing to try to re-engage students who left the institution? Please chat in and share with us all, because we'd love to hear. Sarah, we are all reading and seeing every day about the labor shortages that are affecting the hospitality industry, the airline industry, and many others. And it seems that many adult students are looking at the pandemic as a fresh start to go after more fulfilling and better paying careers. How can colleges rise to this moment and when it seems so many adult workers want more out of their work?
Sure, you're absolutely right. That phenomenon is happening. There's some really great research that's been being conducted by Strata Education Network in conjunction with Gallup over really throughout the pandemic, looking at these adult learners. And there was one report in particular that was a little perplexing, but really informative. So it basically said that, adults' interest in higher education has grown as a result of the pandemic and the economic disruptions, but also their skepticism increased quite a bit about higher education from 2019 to 2020. So in 2019, it was 77% of adults who are considering going back to college said it would be worth the cost. And then in 2020, that dropped to 59%. And then similarly, those who said they expected to get a good job after graduation, that dropped from 89% to 64%. So all of this points to what higher education really needs to do to attract this population in particular is to really create a really strong value proposition and show these adults what the return on their investment is going to be. So I think that means two things. It's tackling cost factors, like, just something like, programs to help make textbooks free or more affordable, so that adults aren't thinking about having to pay out of pocket for that. Paying for things that aren't typically covered by financial aid. So sort of tackling the investment piece of it, but also thinking about the return piece. I think that same report also said that fewer than 1 in 3 adults without a degree had a strong understanding of career pathways and how those link to skills and to academic programs. So really what colleges can think about with that is how they're advising students. And when you're having that first conversation with an adult learner, starting from the conversation with, what are your career goals? What are you trying to accomplish? What does this mean for your life? Really nailing that down, getting a firm understanding of that, and then figuring out what the academic program or the course selection needs to be to support those goals. So I think having that conversation with an adult rather than kind of the conversation about welcome back, what do you want to major in, is really important for this population in particular.
I'd like to add onto Sarah's last point, that these conversations about what you'd like to major in, there's so many new majors now, and some of them are probably not in the realm of thought for people, and some of the advisors, the college-based advisors, might not even be familiar with them. That it's worthwhile, I think, looking over what colleges offer, and that can also be overwhelming. So as people are coming back, facing a very unknown future economy, we don't know where it's going. Some of the fields that seem to be creating high demand for workers are daunting. IT, all the tech fields, they seem very daunting, but there are pockets within them that may be good entry points for people. So familiarizing oneself with everything that the college has to offer, and finding the on-ramps, the areas of interest, and areas that will pay off for people, because many times the college investment is the biggest investment a person will make in their lifetimes. So, you really have to work hard. I fully support what Sarah said. You have to work hard to make sure that you're offering them the best fit for them, something that will pay off not just for 2 or 3 years after college, but for a career that can take many twists and turns.
Thank you so much. And when we think about, you mentioned that college is an investment, and it really is. It's so hard for people to come to the point where they feel comfortable making this decision to return to education. And we want to make sure that when they do make that decision, that they have the supports and resources they need to make sure that this investment pays off for them and their future goals. And like, with traditional age students, we are seeing that enrollment and completion rates for adult learners are significantly lower for Black, Latinx, Asian students and other underrepresented populations compared to white adult learners. And so Hadass, I wanted to ask you, with colleges more focused on equity than ever before, what insights can you give about recruiting and supporting adult learners in a way that's equitable?
I think people like to see people like themselves in conversations. I think I was not born in America, so these are some of the things that I've noticed. The racial equity issue, as everyone knows, is not new. But trained as a linguist, I also appreciate that we speak different languages. Our bodies have different body language. Our choice of how we present, even how you make eye contact in some cultures is not the same. So learning a little bit more about the students that you're trying to recruit goes a great way towards connecting with them, but finding someone who has their lived experience is going to make a huge difference. Because, it's just, it feels like someone who has been in your shoes opening the door for you. It's a lot more inviting than someone telling you what to do, someone beckoning you to say, I've been there, we can do this together, I can coach you, is a lot different than saying, see all these road signs, just follow them. So I think that is one huge investment that colleges can do. And in plain language, be a little bit less white.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I want to sort of add to that I think there's also a structural component to this where, if you look at your policies and your processes, most often you'll find that they were, written, they're on the books. People may not even totally know what they are, but they aren't often revisited from the lens of who the student population is. So we always like to go in and sort of recommend, look at your policies and processes from the lens of, a Black student, a Latinx student, LGBTQ student. Look through those lens of who you're trying to serve, and find out if you see any systemic barriers that your policies and processes are putting in place, and just dismantle them, reinvent them. So I think that there's that sort of human component that Hadass talked about, and then the structural component, and both of those really have to come together if we're going to have equitable outcomes.
And I'd just like to add, Persistence Plus, we also talk a lot about colleges and their alignment of values with their students. And I think now more than ever, because of what the pandemic has done to the unemployment rate and people being furloughed, we often can look to underrepresented populations who are making less money in the workplace than white populations, and say, oh, come to college, you'll get this better job that pays more. But we know from a lot of psychological research how important it is amongst those populations to be thinking about how their work is going to help the community, help other people, create sort of a, help better everyone around them. And so we often see this sort of messaging just around workplace, which is important. And, everyone wants to make more money than they make currently, but is also trying to fit that into more of those cultural values for whatever group you're working with.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you all for sharing around that question. Before we moved into another question, I just wanted to share some thoughts from the audience. And so we had Jenny Klein, who said that her college has been sending postcards to those students who stopped out. And so she shared that this was something that was helpful. So for and effective in reconnecting with these students. And Ross, I had a question for you from an audience member. Maybe you might start off, and then Sarah, Hadass, if you have anything to add, you could jump in. But we had someone who, Monica, who asked, how many touch points on average does it take to get students to return after being stopped out? So Ross, if you have any insights around how to touch students and engage them, I think it'd be really great. And then anyone else that would like to share, please jump in.
Sure. So I know Hadass can speak to this as well, that it's a lot. But yeah, at Persistence Plus, we do, as Hadass mentioned, a lot of this re-engagement work over text messaging. And, traditionally, for many years of our organization, we only worked with students who are actually active in college. But as Serena mentioned, there's just been more emphasis and concern from the colleges we work with about getting students to re-engage. So we're doing more and more of this, behavioral science outreach to students who are not in college to try to get them to return. And certainly, those students, it kind of takes a lot more of this texting with them to get them to respond. And I think, as Hadass mentioned, you got to just sort of stick with them. And when they're ready in that moment, you find they're saving those text messages. They're saving the postcards from Jenny's institution. They're holding on to these things for that moment when it's right for them. And as I mentioned before, I think it's often, it comes to August and it's time to assess, like, can this fit into my life right now? And will it fit for the next 4 or 7 or 12 or 15 weeks or however long this class they want to take is. So definitely a lot of patience involved.
So Ross, another question for you. I would like to turn to traditional age students in this conversation. I know you've been doing research on some of the reasons why 18 to 24-year-olds withdrew or stayed away from college in the context of COVID-19. What have you learned about what students are looking for in their college experience if they do decide to go back after the pandemic has subsided?
Yeah, so it's been really wonderful having an opportunity this spring just to do a lot more talking to students, not in person, of course, but over Zoom as opposed to just via text message. You get to actually see faces, which is amazing. And some of the things I've been reflecting on as far as re-engaging these students is there's something in psychology known as the peak end effect, which is when we evaluate how we feel about a past experience. It's the average of, we'll say for like bad experiences, it's the average of the worst part of that experience and however it was at the end. And so basically we are really biased to think about how things ended versus the whole experience. And if a student dropped out of college, what you find a lot of times is the end of that experience was the worst part of that experience, and they're very biased toward that. So, think about students who either dropped out of college or maybe just had a sort of unenthusiastic end to high school and decided, well, I don't want to continue with education right now. Like, they're biased by having this like poor final experience. And so one of the things I think colleges need to convey is like, what's going to be different now? Like, why is this experience going to be better for you than the last time you were involved in education? And I think some of that is, you can say, like, there was a pandemic, everything changed, and here's ways in which we've evolved to try to make things better, whether it's the flexibility we talked about before with adult learners, or I think a lot of students we're seeing are approaching college, whether they're coming back from not having been in college or they've stayed in college but now they're coming back to fall and it's going to be more in person. We're seeing this kind of best of all worlds mentality. So there was a survey done by Cengage, where they found 73% of students said they're still going to take online courses or they expect to in the future. And over 2/3 said they still expect to be doing hybrid classes and using lots of online technology resources. So the idea of not that these things didn't exist in 2019, but the idea of colleges like welcoming everyone back and it's just like it was in 2019 is not something students are expecting, nor do I think they want. There was a Kaplan survey that talked about what do students want to keep from the pandemic, and 79% said having every lecture recorded so they can go back to it, something a lot of faculty never did. Almost half said they still wanted to have like the ability to go to the class online when they needed it because their kid got sick and they had to stay home, or whatever, or they couldn't commute to campus that day because their car broke down, just get on the computer and come to class. And about a little over a third said they still wanted to be able to live chat with someone during the class to ask questions, because now all of a sudden you don't have to raise your hand in the middle of 300 people and say, I don't understand this concept, explain it to me. Like, you can just chat on the side, and they want to be able to do that. So yeah, I think, these younger students, to re-engage them, they're really looking for a much more evolved kind of hybrid experience from colleges, and that can help convince them that, whatever things were like the last time you were in school, like, it's going to be a different experience for you now. And for these reasons, you will do better, or you will be better able to find your place here.
Ross, you raised, this is a sideline, but it might be an insight. When people are logging in, they want to continue the online conversations. What we found, and this admittedly is a couple years old, is that not all adults have access to a laptop. We found a lot of students completing their entire degree on a smartphone. Or a tablet at best, but most on a smartphone. And phones have gotten larger. And so they're reading, they're writing, they're engaging, they're doing their Zooms, they're doing everything on a smartphone. So I think it bears thinking, how do we engage and how do we stay engaged with people, assuming that they're on a platform that's, I don't know, at best 5 by 7 inches large, and making sure that the smartphone applications work. I know that even with my kids' school, there's some things that don't seem to work on the phone, but you have to log in from a computer. Well, during the pandemic, when my kids were on the computer, I didn't have access to the computer. So, being more aware of what we've been hearing coming out of populations that were more adversely affected during the pandemic, and keeping that in mind, that those situations are likely things that they've been dealing with before and will continue dealing with.
Absolutely. And Sarah, last year, Student Ready Strategies published a report called When the Crisis is Over, about how colleges can be student ready for this post-pandemic era. So I have 2 questions for you. What are some of the best practices for making students who stepped away from COVID-19 feel accepted and supported? And have any of your recommendations changed or evolved in the year since the report was released?
Yeah, thank you. Every time I have to sort of look at that report or revisit it, it takes me back to this period. It's almost triggering for me, because we wrote that at the time when there was no information. It was unclear what anyone could do to help the situation other than kind of stay in their home and wear a mask. And I think, there is still a belief that if we just stay home for a few weeks, that, this thing would subside. And so I think we were overly optimistic as far as the duration of this. But, in looking back at it, I do think a lot of what we were concerned about that would happen really did play out the way we were worried it would. So we looked at 3 distinct populations in this report. So we looked at the unemployed and furloughed adults, which I think we've covered pretty extensively already in this webinar. I will tell you, the thing that even sort of sparked the thinking around the report was, and was keeping me up at night, was this idea of students having so much, sort of financial hardship and having academic disruptions, and that we have all these mechanisms in place for sort of, quality control or whatever that create a lot of barriers for students. So, I mean, the 2 examples we list in the report are, financial holds. If you're not able to pay your bill, you can't register for the next semester. We were really worried about that, even if students wanted to stay enrolled, that if they couldn't pay their bill, that would cause a problem. So we definitely encouraged colleges, at least temporarily, to waive some of those financial holds. And then also to look at their satisfactory academic progress, policies and processes to see if there's a way to be as flexible as possible for students who had a, sort of a disaster semester because of COVID, to be able to keep them enrolled and not have, SAP policies that were written a very long time ago, sort of affecting them in a pandemic when I'm sure none of those policies were written with the idea that there would be a global pandemic. And then the other population we looked at were the rising seniors who were, finishing out their senior year right when COVID hit. And, we knew that there would be testing disruptions in particular. So our recommendations for that group were to waive requirements for ACT and SAT or any type of placement tests, use high school GPA for placement into college level math and English courses, because that would be more widely available. But just to not let testing disruptions get in the way of academic pursuits in general. To your second question, we haven't seen any data that would cause us to rethink any of our recommendations. What we did see, though, is a lot of activity around the idea of going, test optional or test blind. Our thinking evolved as more information came out about that. In terms of understanding the nuance between test blind and test optional. So a test optional being if a student had a test score, it would be considered for admissions or placement. Test blind just says we're not going to look at it for anybody. So there are equity considerations with just being test optional, which means if students did have access to ACT or SAT or could come to campus and take a placement test, they would still be treated inherently differently than students who did not have that access. So really thinking about a test blind policy is really more, we're being more sort of assertive about recommending that for equity considerations and sort of going one step beyond just the test optional.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And one of the main takeaways that we got from your work and others in this area is that re-engaging students, especially adult learners, is really hard and it's time intensive. And so I think this question sort of ties into an audience question that we actually received from Jillian, who asked about what type of outreach you could provide to incoming first year students to ensure that they don't experience any summer melt. And so we'll love to hear from you, Hadass, or others on the panel about, the investment of and the value of doing this type of outreach to students. And then, are there any strategies that our audience can take in specific this summer with certain populations, whether it's incoming students or adult students, to really make sure that they can stay connected to the institutions as they're planning for starting in the fall?
As I'm sure Ross will agree with me, there's a balance between, and it's a psychological balance, right? Between overwhelming someone with too much outreach. And so finding the sweet spot, and for each person, it'll be different. And it's kind of hard to navigate. And also the type of information that will be relevant to them. As for summer melt for new students, I really can't speak to that. I have not worked with people who've never been to college, but people who've stopped out for even many, many years, you really have to find what is bringing them in. We tend to think that people are coming in for going to college for economic reasons, to get a degree that will get them a job. That may be true for only some people. For some people, it may be to prove something to themselves, to prove something to their families. It may be to bide some time. And that's okay too, to kind of say, okay, the market is such now that I don't know where it's going. I may have some other income and, I'm going to take some courses. So in whichever way, you can get to know that person a little bit more without burning the connection, I think that's good. I think what we found that sending things by mail gave us the least return. And we got a 7% return, which I think is considered high. Usually it's like a 2-3% return. So we said, we're not going to spend money on that anyway. Postcards, people just see it's a postcard, they don't read it, they throw it out. If it's a letter, they don't bother opening it. It might be from a debt collector. Nobody wants to deal with that. So finding way, if text might be good depending on people's age. I have friends who their only communication is through text, and I'm finding more businesses are contacting me through text. I have other friends who say email is my preferred method. So I think doing a lot of testing, and then finding the connection and the tone in the connection, and it might not be the same persona if you use personas to connect people. So trying to figure that out. And this again is where I think Persistence Plus is in a really sweet spot to help out.
And, Ross, that sort of leads into the question I had for you. And so maybe you could add on to addressing Jillian's question about summer melt based off of our work with that population. But, we leverage mobile technology as well as behavioral science to get students re-engaged. And so what can you tell the audience about these approaches that can be used in some of the efforts that they're thinking through for the summer?
Sure. So yeah, to jump off, I think, texting with students is really effective, and lots of colleges are trying this in lots of different ways through lots of different platforms. And so just to sort of reply to one of Hadassah's comments about age, we find that it's not like students have different preferences for like how they communicate over text, but text is it's really universal now. And I think people often have this thought of, well, that's something, the 18-year-olds, they're always on their phones doing texting, but everyone does it. And we actually find our older learners on our platform text a lot. They text differently. They tend to text in full and complete sentences and write like paragraphs back on things, and they're not as like quick to respond to every little thing. Yeah, it's almost like a mini email system for people who are a little bit older, whereas younger tend to, short things, more emojis, things like that. But everyone's texting. And so, if you are doing texting with students, or you're thinking about expanding your use of texting with students, the three things that really come to mind that were, I think, things we knew but were underlined by the pandemic is one, that think about texting as a way to convey caring to your students, that you care about what's going on in their lives. To crib something actually Serena says often is, every message is a chance to intervene with a student. And because a lot of colleges fall into, I think, a little bit of a trap is like texting is a way to just send out information in a one-way direction, to make announcements. And so, I encourage colleges, don't use texting as a bullhorn, but as a conversation starter. And as I talked before about really listening to people, this can be a way to listen, because texting some information back and forth is really convenient for a lot of people. And I think also not having some of this bias of that, certain conversations or certain things belong in texting, but then certain conversations, usually the ones we think are more sensitive, belong in an in-person setting. And I think, the conversation itself shouldn't dictate the medium. The student should dictate the medium. Some students will open up to degrees like I never even expected over text message, because it is a little bit more impersonal. It's easier to say some of these distressing or sort of self-threatening things when you're not looking in someone's eyes, sitting in their office, that sort of thing. So, just leaving those pathways open to communicate with students, even if you think it's something like you'd feel better to do it in person. If they don't feel better that way, meet them where they are. And then, as Serena mentioned, the other side of Persistence Plus is this behavioral science piece and crafting these messages based on the best science we know about social psychology and communication strategies and all of that. And of course, it's a whole lot of knowledge to learn. So I would just, sort of summarize it in, what we always say is like, it's not what you say, but how you say it. And so, you have to really carefully think about what is really being conveyed by your messaging. One of the classic examples is if you've heard of social norms, basically the idea that we often behave in ways because other people behave that way, and human beings like to follow the other human beings. So sometimes, we advise our partners to really focus on solutions, and something like lots of students go to the food pantry. So there's a solution, something you should be doing, instead of saying, lots of students go hungry sometimes, because that can sort of normalize the problem and make you think like, oh, if lots of students are going through this, like maybe it's not really that big of a deal. I shouldn't be as like concerned about this because if everyone's going through it. But so yeah, just like little ways of tweaking the framing of messages, or exactly how it's directed can be important. And I just want to quickly bring up, I know one of the questions that was submitted before the webinar was about who should be sending this outreach, and I think that can also vary a lot from our perspective. At Persistence Plus, these text messages are also often coming from a program, sort of a bot type persona. Some of the colleges we work with have come up with like a character. It's not coming from like like, hey, this is Angela, but sort of a more impersonal thing. And I think that works for some students, that whole like opening up thing. But other students might want to know there's a person on the other side. So that was just, I did want to address that. Basically, I don't think there's a perfect answer to that, but trying like different things to see what reaches through to different students. I don't know if Hadass or Sarah, with any of your outreach strategies, you can address, who should be reaching out, or what are the best sources?
Yeah, and I know, thank you, Ross, for that answer, and sort of brought us to our end here, where I wanted us to hear from you all with any final thoughts or comments, or if you wanted to share with the audience ways that they could reach you. But for audience members, thank you so much for joining us today. If you do have any last minute questions, please submit them right now. And as our panelist is going through and they're doing their final thoughts, we'll just make sure that we can send an email to them and let them know that, that you have some questions for them. But Sarah, maybe we could start with you with your final thoughts, and then move on to Hadass, and Ross could close us out.
Sure. Well, I was just thinking as I was listening to Ross talk, and having heard from both of Ross and Hadass throughout this, I always love doing these panels because I learn so much from them. So I just, first of all, just want to thank the other panelists for sharing expertise that now I know more as a result of this, and have a better understanding of what students need. So just want to say thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm very excited about the the opportunities to re-engage these students, and through platforms like Persistence Plus, and by doing the structural reforms at the institutions that make those messages that Ross sends out so much more compelling and persuasive for students to return. So I can be reached anytime. I'll drop my email in the chat, but if you want to follow up on any of the things I spoke about, you can get me by email, or you can also go look at studentreadystrategies.com, and you can contact us through our website there as well. So thank you all for being here. It's been a really great opportunity.
Thank you. I want to echo Sarah's thanks to everyone on the panel, and all of you listening out there this week before the 4th of July, and during this very, very hot week. I personally cannot think of a better place to be than in front of a Zoom camera with the air conditioning. But I think, the way back to full educational institutions is going to take a while. So I think this is a good time to start building up, really looking at what your students and what your students who are not in class, who have not yet indicated that they're returning, want to do. Through whichever platform you can, but the more information you can collect about them, from them, coming from them, I think the stronger your start.
Yes. And again, yeah, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to the other panelists for all your insights. And I'll just finish up by saying for all of you looking to do this work, it's very challenging, but I hope you come away knowing that you don't have to invent the wheel here. There are lots of organizations doing this, and hopefully, we've connected you to 3 right here: Persistence Plus, Student Ready Strategies, and the Graduate Network. And yeah, there's help and research out there, and any of us and other organizations would be very happy to help you